Well, hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to be answering more of your random skincare questions. As always, there will be timestamps or chapters in the description box, so if you want to skip around to a particular question, go right ahead. Number one, does urea release formaldehyde? Short answer, no, it doesn't. Urea is found in moisturizers, body care products, because it is both a humectant and a keratolytic. So it helps with the moisture barrier, it helps exfoliate dry, built up skin cells. It's really good for rough and bumpy skin, keratosis pilaris. It's great for psoriasis. If you have chronic eczema that becomes thickened and what we refer to as lichenified, then urea is a wonderful ingredient for helping soften that thickened skin and improve overall skin moisture retention. And it's naturally present in our skin already as part of our skin's natural moisturizing factors. I think what you may be confusing urea with are formaldehyde releasing preservatives because they have urea in the name. For example, diazolonidyl urea, they're a mouthful, but many of them end in urea. And these are commonly found as preservatives in personal care products, cosmetics, skincare products, and they're not dangerous either. Yes, they do release small amounts of formaldehyde, but that's good because formaldehyde is a biocide, so it prevents contamination of your skincare products. And in those very low amounts, with that controlled slow release, it is not harmful to human health. I think people hear formaldehyde and they automatically assume, oh my God, that's horrible. Why is there formaldehyde? But remember, it's not the poison, it's the dose. Problems that can arise due to formaldehyde releasing preservatives are contact dermatitis. Allergic contact dermatitis, meaning you can develop an allergy to them. That is not out of the realm of possibility. It does happen. But remember, you can develop an allergy to any skincare ingredient. This just happens to be one that does occur maybe a little bit more frequently than some of the other preservatives, although not nearly as frequently as methyl isothiazolinone, which is not a formaldehyde releasing preservative. Anyways, if you do develop an allergy to formaldehyde, it's not something that is actually that easy to avoid. It is pretty ubiquitous in our environment. We're exposed to it pretty much every day. It's present not only in skincare products in very low amounts, but it's also present in the coatings of the bottle. So even if a product is, quote, formaldehyde free, the bottle can be leaching small amounts of formaldehyde. So for people who have a true allergy to it, it's actually kind of difficult to avoid, even more difficult actually than avoiding fragrance. And formaldehyde is also present in a lot of clothing. Formaldehyde resins are used in like wash and wear clothing, ready wear clothing that you don't have to iron, that doesn't wrinkle easily. So yeah, you can develop an allergy, but no, urea, to get back to the original question, urea, the ingredient, does not release formaldehyde at all and is perfectly safe and a wonderful ingredient. It is honestly not hyped up enough. Number two, what can I do about post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation in the armpits? This is actually a pretty common issue that a lot of people deal with, discoloration that's left over from irritation that may have developed either to a product that you were using, or just sweat can be very irritating. So it can be tricky, however, to improve this because most of the things that we use to treat hyperpigmentation are actually too irritating to go in the armpits. Things like hydroquinone, hydroxy acids. So there are only a select few ingredients that are generally well tolerated in the armpits. I recommend choosing moisturizers that have niacinamide or licorice root or soy, because these are gentle on the skin barrier. They're also anti-inflammatory and they help the moisture barrier, so that's going to reduce any further irritation to the skin there. Another thing to consider as you are hoping to improve the hyperpigmentation and get it to go away faster is a break from antiperspirants. Why? Well, antiperspirants, while they're not deadly like the natural deodorant market would have you believe, they can be irritating, and that irritation to the aluminum salts in the antiperspirant can exacerbate the hyperpigmentation. So you may want to take a break from antiperspirants, but I highly discourage using those natural deodorants because, believe it or not, The fragrance in deodorants and antiperspirants is another very common culprit when it comes to not only irritation, but hyperpigmentation in the armpits. To be clear, I would not use any alpha hydroxy acids to the armpit. It can be very irritating. I know it was a trend for a while there on TikTok, seems to have died out a bit, to use mandelic acid in the armpit. I would discourage doing that because it can be very irritating. Anyways. I have seborrheic dermatitis. It's finally under control. What can I do to prevent flares in the future? That is an excellent question because seborrheic dermatitis is a chronic inflammatory condition. Yes, it can calm down, which sounds like is the case for you, but it will come and go and flare with common triggers. So being mindful of your triggers is the first step. Things that trigger seborrheic dermatitis are sun exposure, as well as stress and illness if you get sick. So, I mean, obviously you can't avoid illness, you get a cold, whatever, I mean, it happens. But obviously protect your skin from the sun, wearing a broad spectrum sunscreen. Don't stay out in the sun during midday exposure and wear sun protective clothing. Try to manage your stress. Good luck with that, I know it's hard. Don't allow yourself to get behind on your sleep. One way to reduce the number of flares that you experience is to actually treat the scalp with an anti-dandruff shampoo. That seems to help the seborrheic dermatitis, which often is on the face, although it can happen on any body site. But it seems like treating the scalp with an anti-dandruff shampoo can actually prevent flares of facial seborrheic dermatitis. Dandruff and seborrheic dermatitis, they're the same thing. But dandruff is just like the flakes in your scalp, and seborrheic dermatitis are those greasy red patches that are flaky. They can happen like around the nose most commonly, around the mouth, the forehead, in the eyebrow area. So treating the scalp actually with an anti-dandruff shampoo, whether that be zinc pyrithione, selenium sulfide, salicylic acid shampoo, it can help cut down on the burden of that little yeast, malassezia, that seems to be at the heart of this chronic inflammatory skin condition. And it's not so much that the yeast causes it, it's your body's immune response to that yeast, which is naturally present on everyone's skin. So you don't want to eradicate that. It's part of your skin microbiome, but some people do have this heightened inflammatory response to it, and it can lead to things like seborrheic dermatitis. So in addition to treating the scalp a few times a week, the other thing to do is to, obviously I already said wear sunscreen, but in your skincare routine, try and incorporate salicylic acid into your routine in some way, shape, or another. Whether that be washing your face daily with a salicylic acid cleanser, lathering it to the areas where you're most prone to seborrheic dermatitis, leaving it on the skin a few minutes and then rinsing it off, or using a salicylic acid leave-on product. I'm rather fond of that Cetaphil acne mattifying moisturizer. It has 0.5% salicylic acid in it, and it's very lightweight. It's not greasy. So I would suggest that, or the Peach Slices salicylic acid moisturizer. It's an oil-free moisturizer. That would also be a great choice. It has centella in it, which is anti-inflammatory. For some patients, we will prescribe a prescription steroid cream to use in an as-needed fashion for really bad flares, just to those areas. But make sure, you know, that's something you're going to discuss with your dermatologist, because as I've talked about in other videos, there are some potential side effects and risks to using steroid creams on the face. You can also use those anti-dandruff shampoos to the face, but you may find that shampoos on the face are a little drying and irritating. Instead, I would highly suggest a product that I adore. It is by one of my favorite brands, not sponsored, Vanicream. Their Vanicream Z Bar. It is a zinc pyrithione facial bar that is really good, not only for seborrheic dermatitis, but really for, I think it's great for a lot of inflammatory skin conditions, rosacea, eczema, and acne, just because it kind of, zinc pyrithione is anti-inflammatory, and it kind of helps control some of the inflammatory responses to some of the yeasts that naturally live on the skin that can aggravate any kind of chronic inflammatory skin condition. So that is a really great product to use on your face. Number 4, can you recommend some skincare tips for a dry climate? Basically, when you live in a dry climate, the lack thereof of humidity, the dryness in the air, it creates this gradient for moisture to be sucked out of your skin, making you more prone to dryness. Running a humidifier in your home is going to be a saving grace. I always tell people to run a humidifier at least at nighttime when they're dealing with dry skin, because that's really when our skin loses a lot more water. But if you live in a dry climate, it can be beneficial to run the humidifier during the day as well. Make sure you get a humidifier that is intended to humidify an entire room. Don't stay in the shower too long. That will end up drying out the skin further. If you live in a cold, dry climate, it's really hard to tolerate those cool to lukewarm shower temperatures that I always recommend. It can be really tempting to crank up the heat. Just be mindful that that hot water is a big part of what dries out the skin even further. Consider not showering every day. If you don't, especially if you don't work up a sweat, maybe just, take a day off of showering. There's no rule. There are no rules in skincare aside from protecting your skin from the sun, but there's no rule that says that you have to bathe every day. You certainly don't need to bathe every day if you're not really getting sweaty or dirty or anything like that. So that might be something that is helpful for you. People, as they get into their wiser years, their skin makes less oil, is a lot more prone to dryness. The other thing when it comes to a dry climate is after you get out of the shower, go ahead and put moisturizer on right away. Moisturizer is going to be your friend in a dry climate because it will help slow down water loss out of the skin. Choose cream or ointment formulations over lotions. Lotions are more watery and they don't slow water loss out of the skin to the same extent as creams or ointments. Ointments are really occlusive and really trap in that hydration. So if you are really dealing with a lot of dry skin, then I would suggest an ointment in that case, like petrolatum, Vani-Ply ointment. Many people like Aquaphor. Y'all know I love CeraVe Healing Ointment. A skincare product you need to be careful of if you live in a dry climate are those hyaluronic acid serums. I enjoy using those, but if you live in a dry climate, you have to be mindful of how you use them if you choose to even, because many people in a dry climate simply don't tolerate them. Hyaluronic acid serums, they work to pull water into the top layers of the skin, increasing skin hydration, plumping up skin cells, and smoothing out the look of wrinkles and fine lines. But if you don't pair them with a moisturizer, and moisturizers have occlusive ingredients in them that slow water loss out of the skin. If you don't pair them with a moisturizer, what can happen is that water that they have pulled into the top layer of the skin ends up just evaporating. And as it does evaporate, it pulls more water out of the skin. This is the case no matter where you live, but it's especially more common and more of a problem in a dry climate because you have a greater moisture gradient pulling water out of the skin in a dry climate. So if you choose to use hyaluronic acid serums, make sure you immediately put a moisturizer on over them to make sure that you don't end up losing more water out of the skin. But some people, even with moisturizers, they find they don't tolerate hyaluronic acid serums in their skincare routine. It's just too drying. Now, when you choose a moisturizer, you'll notice many of them have sodium hyaluronate, which is the salt of hyaluronic acid, by the way. Many of them have hyaluronic acid in them. Do you need to avoid that in moisturizing creams and whatnot? No, the creams are going to have the occlusive in there, but some people are very sensitive to hyaluronic acid applied topically for whatever reason, in which case, yeah, then avoid it. I don't think Vani cream has hyaluronic acid in it, and Vaseline petroleum jelly certainly doesn't. If you find that your skin is flaky and dry, do not pick the flakes because that just further disrupts the skin barrier, causes more water to leave the skin. What I find to be helpful for dealing with the flaky stuff is actually to massage a little bit of a body oil or facial oil onto those flakes because it helps them gently dislodge without disrupting the underlying moisture barrier. Lastly, I did get some questions here and then over on Instagram about this paper that came out. If you're not familiar, this study came out that showed that sunscreen ingredients broke down when they were mixed with zinc oxide and exposed to UV light, and that the degraded mixtures had less UVA protection and were toxic to zebrafish embryos. So basically what they did is they took chemical sunscreen ingredients and mixed them together, exposed them to UV, and they showed that the protection was more or less fine. However, they showed that when they added zinc oxide to these mixtures, that the protection declined. And when they added the mixtures plus zinc oxide to developing zebrafish embryos, they had toxic effects. So there were several problems with this study. First of all, you have to bear in mind the overall model system that they're using. These are zebrafish embryos being exposed to these ingredients. This is very, very different than putting them on the skin. Putting these ingredients on the skin is not going to result in systemic absorption to the extent that it would ever cause any harm to human health. And you have to bear in mind that we have been using these ingredients for decades, and there's zero evidence of any harm to human health. But if you actually look at the study, there were a few things that just don't make much sense. First of all, it's actually pretty well known that avobenzone, the chemical sunscreen ingredient, is not stable as is, and it does photodegrade. It does degrade. That is one limitation of avobenzone. And that combining avobenzone with some mineral actives actually may increase the rate at which that degradation occurs. However, because we know this and have known it for a long time, sunscreen manufacturers go to great lengths to stabilize avobenzone and to confirm photostability of their ingredients. So it's not something you need to actually worry about in your sunscreens. But the way they did this study, they're not using photostabilized avobenzone. They're just using avobenzone, the ingredient. They're not adding other ingredients like antioxidants. I mean, there are a variety of ways in which avobenzone is stabilized in products. And the other problem is that the zinc oxide that they use is not coated. And in the majority of mineral sunscreens are going to be using coated zinc oxide, which reduces the reactivity with other ingredients. So makes it safe to have what we call combination sunscreens or hybrid sunscreens, some people refer to them as, where you have zinc oxide and then you have some chemical filters. But this study didn't use coated zinc, so you wouldn't really find uncoated zinc in sunscreens, maybe some of the natural ones, but the natural ones are not going to have chemical filters in them either. So this, I mean, these kinds of things were already known well before this study. It's addressed and taken care of in the sunscreens that you buy in the store. Another problem here is that the researchers mixed the ingredients together in something called DMSO, which sunscreens would never be mixed in DMSO. Some studies actually suggest that DMSO will degrade avobenzone. One of the real advantages of studying zebrafish is that they develop outside of the mother, so you can see them, and they're transparent embryos, so you can actually look at them as they're developing and see if there are any developmental abnormalities that are occurring. So they're a good animal model for screening for toxicity, gene effects, and things like that. They're used as a screening tool, not as a proof of toxicity tool. So it's kind of an odd approach in my mind to take an ingredient that is applied topically and has been for decades and decades and decades, and then look at them in this model. It doesn't seem logical. So does that mean zinc oxide is toxic? No, you're not a developing zebrafish embryo. Applying zinc oxide to the skin is more than safe. It's not absorbed into the body. We've been using it for decades. And so, no, I mean, it's not toxic at all, and it's not going to make your chemical sunscreen toxic. And chemical sunscreens that have avobenzone in them, that ingredient in sunscreens is stabilized, and that the formulations undergo photostability testing. This study doesn't really capture topical sunscreen use. There are other ingredients in sunscreens that contribute to the final formulation, the stability of the ingredients, and you have this film being formed on the surface of the skin. So this really just doesn't mimic real world use at all. I would argue it is unethical that the media publicized this the way that it did. Honestly, it wasn't like major news, but enough news sources covered it that you guys heard about it and were asking it. And I think that is unethical. Why? Because this study is done in such a way that the vast majority of the public is not going to have the training and experience to interpret and to realize that this has nothing to do with human use of sunscreen. It's unnecessary fear-mongering and makes people even more resistant to sunscreen. We're living in a world today where we have access to a lot of information, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to the fact that we may not always have the skill set to interpret that information. That's really important for your mental health, because people get unnecessarily anxious about reading stuff like this, and you're going to have more access as time goes on to more and more information that you may not be able to interpret. I would not rely on the media to interpret the information for you, because the media poses information in such a way so as to generate clicks. I would instead discuss with your healthcare provider if it's something medically related, and they can help explain the study and allay your concerns and explain it in a way that, is easy to understand. There is definitely a downside to having so much access to information that we're not necessarily trained to interpret. It can generate a lot of unnecessary fear, and I don't understand why the study was publicized in the way that it was. It just evokes even more mistrust in sunscreens. When media sources publicize things like this and it gets out into the public, it becomes a false fixed belief that's very hard to break. It's very hard. I mean, it's very hard to convince people once it's already been put out there. And a lot of people at baseline have a high level of mistrust for the medical community. Either they had a bad experience in childhood or a family member had a bad experience, and that has a trickle-down effect for generations and generations. And so there's already a high level of mistrust. Having the media fuel that further is problematic. I mean, it's problematic. We can see it in our everyday lives now more than ever. Anyways, you guys, I hope that answered your questions and you enjoyed this Q&A. If so, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and as always, don't forget, sunscreen and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.